Why does conflict seem to be at the heart of every major social change? From the labor movements of the early 20th century to modern tech worker walkouts, from civil rights boycotts to digital activism. The story of human progress often reads like a battlefield report. Today, we find ourselves in a world where the richest 1% controls 43% of global wealth, where CEOs earn 344 times more than their average workers, and where automation threatens to displace millions of jobs by 2030. This struggle isn't new. In fact, it's as old as society itself. According to conflict theory, a fundamental principle in sociology, society isn't held together by shared values or common goals. Instead, it's shaped by constant competition between groups fighting over limited resources, whether those resources are wealth, power, status, or opportunity. But here's what's fascinating. These conflicts, as destructive as they sometimes are, have repeatedly transformed society in unexpected ways. Today, we're going to explore 5 historic conflicts that revolutionized how we understand society. These aren't just stories of protest and resistance. They're windows into the very mechanics of social change. From a bus boycott that brought a city to its knees, to a factory fire that revolutionized worker safety, to a cultural revolution that reshaped an entire nation, each of these conflicts reveals something profound about how society changes. And more importantly, they help us understand the conflicts we face today. What you're about to learn isn't just history. It's a toolkit for understanding the social tensions shaping our world right now. So let's dive in and discover how conflict, despite its costs, has been one of humanity's most powerful engines of progress. Picture this. It's 1886, and you're working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, in conditions so dangerous that one wrong move could cost you your life. Your children work alongside you because your wages alone can't feed the family. There are no breaks, no safety regulations, and no right to complain. This was reality for millions of American workers during the Industrial Revolution. But what happened next would become one of the most dramatic examples of how conflict theory plays out in the real world. In 1919 alone, over 4 million workers participated in strikes, including 365,000 steelworkers and 400,000 miners. Between 1881 and 1905, America saw thousands of labor strikes, each one a battlefield in what Karl Marx had predicted: the inevitable conflict between workers and factory owners. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York claimed 146 lives, mostly young immigrant women who were locked inside the building. This tragedy wasn't just a workplace accident, it was the direct result of a system that prioritized profit over human life. The mortality rate for American factory workers was staggering. In 1900, the fatality rate for railroad workers was around 8.52 per thousand workers, while coal miners faced a death rate of 3.53 per thousand. But here's where conflict theory shows its explanatory power. This clash between workers and owners didn't just result in violence and tragedy. It forced concrete changes. Labor unions gained legal recognition. Child labor laws were enacted. Workplace safety regulations were established. The 8-hour workday became standard. Today, when we walk into a workplace with fire exits, safety equipment, and regulated working hours, we're looking at the direct results of this historic conflict. But the story isn't over. In 2024, we're seeing a resurgence of labor activism, particularly in the tech sector, where 67% of workers say they would join a union if given the chance. This brings us to a key insight about conflict theory. Economic conflicts don't just redistribute resources, they fundamentally reshape society's rules and structures. The labor movement didn't just win better conditions for workers, it transformed our basic assumptions about the relationship between employers and employees, about the role of government in protecting workers, and about the very nature of workplace rights. What started as a conflict over wages and working conditions became a revolution in how we think about work itself. And that's the power of conflict theory. It shows us how struggles over resources can lead to profound social transformations that nobody could have predicted at the start. The struggle for women's suffrage wasn't just about voting rights. It was a fundamental challenge to the entire system of power in American society. And it provides a perfect case study of how conflict theory extends beyond economic battles to encompass struggles over political power and social status. Consider this. In 1910, women earned just 54 cents for every dollar earned by men. But the real inequality went far deeper than wages. Women were systematically excluded from political participation based on the assumption that they were naturally unsuited for civic life. The suffragettes' response was revolutionary. They didn't just politely ask for inclusion. They launched a coordinated campaign of civil disobedience that would make modern protest organizers take notes. The numbers tell a dramatic story. During the peak of protest activity between 1910 and 1920, at least 218 women were arrested for peaceful protests at the White House gates alone. But here's where conflict theory reveals its deeper insights. The resistance to women's suffrage came not just from men protecting their political monopoly, but from women who had internalized the existing power structure. This illustrates a key principle of conflict theory. Dominant groups maintain their power not just through force, but by convincing subordinate groups to accept their subordination as natural and proper. The suffragettes didn't just have to win voting rights. They had to shatter deeply held beliefs about gender, power, and the natural order of society. Their tactics were deliberately shocking for the time. They staged hunger strikes. They endured forced feedings in prison. They picketed the White House during wartime, a move that was seen as nearly treasonous. Why such dramatic tactics? Because they understood that real change requires more than just legal victories. It requires disrupting the social consensus that maintains inequality. This is a classic example of conflict theory in action. When one group monopolizes power, peaceful negotiation often isn't enough. The subordinate group must create enough social tension to force change. The results were transformative. After women won the right to vote in 1920, it became increasingly difficult to maintain other forms of gender-based discrimination. The conflict over suffrage had cracked the foundation of assumed male superiority, leading to questions about other gender-based restrictions in education, employment, and civic life. But here's the most relevant insight for today. The impact of this conflict continues to ripple through society. In 2024, women still earn just 83 cents on the dollar compared to men, down from 84 cents in 2022. This persistent gap shows how even after formal equality is achieved, the underlying conflict over resources and power continues. The suffrage movement teaches us something crucial about conflict theory. Social change isn't just about changing laws, it's about challenging and transforming the fundamental assumptions that justify inequality. And sometimes, That requires creating discomfort and tension in society. The suffragettes understood that making people uncomfortable was not just an unfortunate side effect of their campaign, it was essential to its success. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, she wasn't just challenging segregation, she was exposing how racial conflict fundamentally shaped American society. The civil rights movement provides perhaps the clearest example of how conflict theory explains both systematic oppression and the dynamics of social change. In 1950, in southern states like Mississippi, only 5.1% of voting-age African Americans were registered to vote. The economic disparities were staggering. The response? Strategic conflict. The Montgomery bus boycott alone cost the city $3,000 per day, equivalent to tens of thousands in today's money. This wasn't just protest, it was economic warfare. Dr. King's nonviolent resistance wasn't passive. It was a sophisticated strategy to create what he called creative tension, forcing the dominant group to confront the reality of injustice. Meanwhile, Malcolm X's militant approach reflected a different interpretation of conflict theory, the belief that power only responds to power. Both approaches, however, recognized a fundamental truth. The racial hierarchy wasn't just about prejudice, it was about power and resources. Segregation wasn't just about separation, it was about maintaining economic and political control. This is why the resistance to civil rights was so fierce. It threatened an entire system of power distribution. Take voter registration drives. By 1970, thanks to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, many southern states had over 50% of African Americans registered to vote. This wasn't just about voting rights, it was about fundamentally redistributing political power. But here's the key insight about conflict theory that the civil rights movement reveals. Institutional power structures don't yield to moral arguments alone, they respond to pressure. The movement succeeded not just because it was morally right, but because it created enough social and economic tension to make maintaining segregation more costly than ending it. Today, when we see racial wealth gaps persisting, with reports showing Black Americans still face significant economic disparities, we're witnessing the ongoing nature of this conflict. The formal victories of the civil rights movement didn't end the underlying struggle over resources and power. They just transformed its nature. What's particularly relevant for today's activists is understanding how the civil rights movement strategically escalated conflict. They didn't just protest. They targeted the economic and political foundations of segregation. The Montgomery bus boycott wasn't just about buses. It was about demonstrating Black economic power. Lunch counter sit-ins weren't just about getting served. They were about forcing businesses to choose between segregation and profit. This strategic approach to conflict continues to influence modern movements. When we see today's activists targeting corporate sponsors or using social media to organize boycotts, they're following a playbook written by civil rights leaders who understood that social change requires more than moral appeals. It requires strategic pressure on power structures. The Cultural Revolution in China stands as perhaps the most extreme example of conflict theory deliberately weaponized for social transformation. It demonstrates both the immense power of conflict to reshape society and the devastating consequences when conflict theory is taken to its logical extreme. Let's look at the raw numbers. Between 1966 and 1976, an estimated 1.5 million people died during the Cultural Revolution. But the true scale of disruption goes far beyond mortality. Internal investigations by the Chinese Communist Party estimated between 1.2 and 1.7 million deaths, with roughly equal numbers permanently injured. Mao didn't just allow conflict to happen, he actively cultivated it as a tool of social transformation. He deliberately pitted groups against each other, targeting intellectuals, scientists, and anyone deemed part of the bourgeois class. These weren't random acts of violence, they were the systematic application of conflict theory as a political weapon. The persecution of intellectuals was particularly severe. Millions of educated individuals were displaced or persecuted, labeled as the stinking old ninth, and subjected to public humiliation, forced labor, and worse. This wasn't just about eliminating opposition. It was about fundamentally restructuring Chinese society by destroying its cultural and intellectual foundations. What makes this example so powerful for understanding conflict theory is how it shows that social conflicts aren't just about economic resources. They can be about cultural power, knowledge, and ways of thinking. The Cultural Revolution wasn't primarily about redistributing wealth. It was about redistributing cultural authority and redefining what counted as legitimate knowledge. The consequences were profound. Entire systems of traditional knowledge were disrupted. Universities were closed. Scientific research ground to a halt. Family members were turned against each other. Students were encouraged to denounce their teachers. This wasn't chaos. It was the deliberate use of conflict to break down existing social bonds and create new ones. But here's the key insight. While conflict theory helps us understand how social change happens, the Cultural Revolution shows us what happens when conflict becomes an end in itself rather than a means to positive social transformation. When conflict is deliberately maximized rather than strategically employed, the result isn't just change, it's devastation. This has crucial implications for understanding modern social movements. While conflict may be necessary for social change, the Cultural Revolution teaches us that uncontrolled or deliberately maximized conflict can destroy the very society it aims to improve. It's a stark reminder that while conflict theory explains how social change occurs, it doesn't automatically justify any particular use of conflict as a tool of change. The legacy of the Cultural Revolution continues to influence China today, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of weaponizing social conflict. It shows us that while conflict may be inevitable in social change, how we manage and channel that conflict matters enormously for its outcomes. And now we arrive at our number one example, modern wealth inequality, which isn't just another instance of conflict theory. It's the battlefield where all of today's social conflicts converge. Consider these staggering numbers. As of 2024, the top 1% globally controls 43% of all financial assets. This means the richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 95% of humanity combined. Today's CEOs earn 344 times more than their average workers, up from just 21 times in 1965. This isn't just a statistic, it's a pressure point creating new forms of class conflict. The rise of the gig economy exemplifies this transformation. From 10.7% of the workforce in 2015, gig workers now make up 36% of American workers in 2024. That's 59 million people working without traditional job security or benefits. By 2030, between 9.3 and 30% of current jobs could be automated. This isn't just about unemployment. It's about a fundamental restructuring of power relationships in society. What makes this example so crucial is how it demonstrates the evolution of class conflict in the digital age. Traditional labor strikes have been joined by new forms of resistance. When tech workers organize walkouts over ethical concerns, or when social media becomes a battleground for economic justice, we're seeing conflict theory play out in real time on digital platforms. In 2024, 28 Google employees were fired for protesting Project Nimbus, while Amazon faced coordinated strikes from 10,000 workers, showing how old patterns of conflict adapt to new contexts. When we see 36% of tech workers participating in union organizing activities, or 67% expressing willingness to join unions, we're witnessing the same dynamics that drove historical social movements, just in new forms. Life expectancy gaps between rich and poor Americans have widened to 15 years for men and 10 years for women. This isn't just an economic statistic. It's a measure of how wealth inequality literally shapes who lives and who dies. Modern wealth inequality isn't just another example of conflict theory. It's the lens through which we can understand most of today's social tensions. Whether we're talking about housing affordability, healthcare access, educational opportunity, or political influence, wealth inequality shapes the battlefield where these conflicts play out. From the labor battles of the 1900s to today's struggles over technological power and wealth inequality, conflict theory continues to provide crucial insights into how societies change. Each example we've examined shows how social transformation often emerges not from peaceful evolution or reasonable debate, but from the pressure points where different groups' interests collide. First, how would Karl Marx analyze the current tensions between tech companies and their workers? Consider the paradox of tech workers who are well paid by global standards but still feel exploited enough to organize walkouts and protests. Second, can you identify a current social movement and explain it using conflict theory? Think about who has power, who wants change, and what resources they're fighting over. Third, what role does social media play in modern social conflicts? How has it changed the way groups organize, resist, and challenge existing power structures? And finally, how might conflict theory predict future social changes based on current inequalities? With automation threatening up to 30% of jobs by 2030 and wealth concentration continuing to increase, what kinds of conflicts might we anticipate? Remember, understanding conflict theory isn't just an academic exercise. It's a tool for making sense of the social changes happening around us right now. Whether you're an activist seeking change or simply trying to understand why society works the way it does, recognizing the role of conflict in social transformation is essential for navigating our complex world.